You're listening to Canary Cry Radio.
Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and were gathered together at Shoko, which belongeth to Judah, and pitched between Shoko and Azekah in Ephes-dammim. And Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together and pitched by the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. And the Philistines stood on a mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on a mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them. And there went out a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. And he had an helmet of brass upon his head, and he was armed with a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of brass. And he had greaves of brass upon his legs, and a target of brass between his shoulders. And the staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. And one bearing a shield went before him, and he stood and cried unto the armies of Israel, and said unto them, Why are ye come out to set your battle in array? Am not I a Philistine, and ye servants to Saul? Choose you a man for you, and let him come down to me. If he be able to fight with me and to kill me, then will we be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then shall ye be our servants and serve us. The Philistine said, I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man that we may fight together.
Here's Basil and Gauntz.
Hey everybody. Hey everybody, and welcome to Canary Cry Radio. My name is Basil.
And this is Gauntz. Welcome to episode number 80.
Yay.
I'm always hoping for something creative, but you know.
Well, I feel like I my first instinct is always to go, that's one more. It just keeps getting bigger. But I think that joke wore out long ago.
That's true. We have today a guest who is a returning guest. He was here back in episode number 45, and he had a cameo in episode 63. Yeah. He's the award-winning screenwriter, and he is the novelist of the Chronicles of the Nephilim. He's here to talk about David Ascendant, our good friend Brian Godawa. Brian, yay. Welcome back.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on this new episode, David and the Giants.
You've been waiting this whole time to do that. I think that's excellent. Yes, David Ascendant, the 7th book in the Chronicles of the Nephilim series. I mean, I know I've been waiting all year for this. How about you, Gons?
Absolutely. But before we get going here,
oh boy,
if you, I don't know if you listened to our, your cameo appearance back in episode 63. This was back the live show.
Uh-oh.
Yeah. And Basil, this is a misunderstanding.
You love bringing this up.
I do. I just think it's so funny.
Bringing this up.
I love it because it's so funny. Well, Basil, on the fly,
was the live one. This was the live episode.
I know.
No, I know you know. I'm telling everybody else.
Okay.
Don't get sassy with me, Gons.
As we were calling different guests up, one of them happened to be Brian. And Brian was walking up, and Basil goes,
If only we had a friend in the building who is an award-winning screenwriter. Oh, there he is, Mr. Giant Face.
So, Basil, I want you to explain yourself to Mr. Brian.
I don't feel like I need to explain myself because we had a 30-foot projection screen with your face on it. I just want to know, how did that feel?
Oh, it felt like a Nephilim.
That's a better answer than I could have even contrived. That's great. Yeah, it was, because I remember, because what happened was I just turned around and there you were. The picture we had for you, like we had other people, but it's like a bust picture, it's like their whole upper body. But the picture we had for you was just like your face.
Okay.
30 feet tall.
All right, fair enough.
I liked it. I mean, I feel like we should do that all the time, even if it just has nothing to do with you.
Well, Basil, I will never bring that up again. I just wanted to say it one more time. But moving on, Dr. Mike Heiser was recently on Beyond Extraordinary with Natalina, and she actually seems to have found something out about you and Dr. Mike Heiser, possibly working on a project. Is there anything you can tell us about it?
Not really. We're in talks. We're in negotiations. We are discussing working together on a possible project.
Okay.
That's about all it is right now. In fact, we're going to have more clarity after this month because we're going to get together at the SBL conference, which is the Society of Biblical Literature, and we're going to see each other there and have a little bit more detailed discussions about something. So, but we'll announce it if it happens.
Cool. All right, that's fair enough.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about David Ascendant. This is the 7th book in the series, and I am on the website right now, and I would just like to start the conversation by saying that you have like the most awesome media that you have on the website. You've got these pictures of the characters in your book, and did you get these taken or like these are amazing. The characters are just so, I don't know, imaginative and
Thank you.
shot, and it's just great. I'm scared of most of them. Like I have visceral reactions of fear. Like, this is awesome.
Yeah, that's a very good thing to point out. I appreciate that, Basil. The thing is, I have been a graphic designer for many years, so that's one of the reasons why I design my whole website, all my book covers and everything. And one of the things that I wanted to do was I wanted to sort of cast my stories because I'm a visual artist, not just a writer, and visuals help me actually process things and stuff. So what I did actually was, believe it or not, all those pictures are simply, I go on one of the stock photo websites, that are on the internet. Shutterstock in particular is the one that, you pay a certain price and you get access to all of them. And they have so many of them. And of course, 80% of them are total garbage,
Right, yeah.
Really cheap stuff. But nowadays, like 10 years ago, it was really hard to find something good. But now I am blown away because I go searching for in pictures of warriors, just, type in warriors, and you get so many options that I found I was able, it takes me like a good 3 or 4 days of full-time labor looking for pictures. But I find that I can find pretty much a cool picture that kind of fits every character that I've written in all my Chronicles of the Nephilim. So if you go to the website, chroniclesofthenephilim.com, you click on one of the books, and then you select synopsis/characters. It'll show you a synopsis of the story, and then that's where I have my little pictures of my characters, and I give you brief descriptions of them. Right. And I just found that actually, believe it or not, I cast my books when I'm about halfway through writing them, because what I found was I actually sometimes find... when I'm casting, I find characters that give me ideas for my characters in my novels that I hadn't thought of. And so a lot of times those pictures have influenced my novels and given me story elements. I sometimes some real critical story elements, like, there was one where I had a picture of Joab, and it had a scar on his face, and I thought, well, should I get rid of that scar in Photoshop? I thought, no, I can make it part of his character. And then I realized that it actually fit into one of the major plot points of the story with Joab and Abishai and David. Right. And people are going to love it. So anyway, yeah, it's the visuals help me to cast, but it also kind of gives people a feel for the kind of like movies, because I come from the movie world, so I like to make things look like movies, and that's just part of the process.
No, and this very much so accomplishes that. It looks like a fully cast, gnarly Hollywood movie that I want to see. But I think it's so great because when you are reading books, we all kind of cast the characters in our heads ourselves, which some would argue is the beautiful thing about books, which is true in some sense. But this right here, giving me a visual of it, I mean, I'm kind of wish that I had free time right now to go read the book and instead of just talking about it.
Cool.
But there you go. So that's awesome. Also on your website here, you have some awesome trailers too, as far as, making the whole movie element go.
Yeah. Again, that comes from my movie background, and nowadays, it's book advertising, marketing has picked up a lot from movies, and so even traditional book publishers now make little book trailers, but they're usually pretty cheap and not very interesting to me, and I just felt like, I don't have the money to make something look like a movie trailer, but again, if you go to these stock video houses and you look really hard and long, you find some really cool images that end up becoming very useful. And so I've made a trailer for each of the books in the series, and it's been one of my inspiring processes for processing the story as I'm writing it.
Absolutely. And I mean, me and Gons were talking about this before, and some of our listeners might know that I have a tendency to explore the vocal creativity that God has blessed me with.
Oh, cool.
And the first time I read this, or I watched this trailer, I just instinctually started reading some of the text you have. And I would like to audition for your next trailer voice. Okay, are you ready?
All right.
Here we go.
Israel, 1000 BC. A mad king. An evil witch. Fallen watchers. Warring Philistines. And 6 giant assassins. All out to kill the chosen one. David of Judah.
So there you go. There's my You like that?
Oh, you're hired.
I'm out of here. I got a real job now.
I love it.
So there's a little taste for everybody. Make sure to go check out the trailer for the book. Okay. There you go, Gons. You got anything? I kind of just hijacked this trying to further my career in voiceover artistry.
So one of the things that we noticed when we were watching the trailer here is early on, we weren't sure if the imagery of the lizard eye, the reptilian eye, was a Philistine or if it was reference to the Watchers or what. But we wanted to ask you, like, what was the lizard eye? And if it was a Philistine, were the Philistines reptilians?
No.
Okay.
The Philistines were not. Yeah. The reptilian eye really has to do with the Watchers being, the seed of the serpent and that's the connection. So, but however, obviously, one of the connections that I do make is, that the Nephilim being the offspring of, the Nephilim being the offspring of the fallen Watchers with the human women. They might be connected to that in some way, but I didn't give them reptilian eyes. I think based on my research, and this isn't, there's not a lot of material to in this area, but the Rephaim in the time of David, you'll hear the term Rephaim a lot in 1st and 2nd Samuel and Chronicles, and that term is a reference to the giants. And I think that based on my research, it appears that the Rephaim has a long ancient history of meaning of what it meant. It used to mean, in Ugarit, it used to mean dead, fallen warrior kings who also may have been giants. Ooh, and then in the earlier pages of the Bible, like Genesis and Numbers and Deuteronomy, Rephaim appear to be a specific clan of giants in the Promised Land, along with the Anakim, the Emim and the Zemzumim and such. And then by the time of David, it seems like either the Rephaim are the only ones being referenced, the only clan maybe still alive, or I think more than likely it became a generic term for the giants, and the leftover giants, such as Goliath and the other giants there, were not necessarily Philistines in the sense, like they were Philistine citizens, so to speak, but I think that they were indigenous to Canaan, whereas the Philistines were sea peoples who came and marauded Canaan and set up their cities on the coast. And so doing research into that, my point is that I don't think that the Rephaim, like Goliath, are necessarily Philistine by birth. You know what I mean? They're more like Philistine citizens.
Oh, that's actually really interesting. And that kind of brings me to my first point that I'd like to talk about. And that is, I mean, you have such a creative exposition about what you're doing. And, you're taking these biblical kind of fringe topics here and turning them into basically fantasy fiction, which is something that authors have done before and have been doing. But this is a really interesting way to do it. Instead of replacing characters, with other characters, like replacing some biblical figure with, say, a wizard or a hobbit or something like that. You're actually telling the story more or less with the true characters. When going through this project, I mean, obviously, there's a lot of room to play around, but it seems like you put a lot of work into staying as true as you can.
Yeah, that was a tightrope that I walked because, I knew that if I'm going to retell Bible stories, which is what the Chronicles of the Nephilim does, basically the premise of the Chronicles of the Nephilim was, years ago when I first looked into the Nephilim, I discovered, oh my gosh, there's a storyline here underneath that runs throughout the whole Bible, something that I hadn't seen before with my Western eyes. And when I found that storyline, I thought this story has to be told. But of course, the Bible's huge, right? And there's so many stories and so many details, you can't tell it all. So I thought, well, here's going to be the premise of the series. I'm going to only retell those stories in the Bible where Nephilim or giants or maybe watchers are talked about. And so that became the premise. But then I said, okay, there's a supernatural element going on here, and I wanted to show the spiritual warfare. But look, we don't really see what's behind the curtain. We don't really know, and so anything is going to be a guess. And I thought, well, I'll do it with a touch of fantasy to it, and then that way people won't get the impression that you're just making up all this fantasy stuff and the Bible's just a fairy tale. It's like, no, I'm using the genre to tell a theological novel, not a historical novel. Ooh. It may very well be something similar to this for all I know, but I don't know. So I decided to push the envelope and say, okay, I'm going to show the spiritual warfare. But then I also thought, well, there's some cool poetic images in the Bible that I wanted to make them come alive. And so, for example, the example I always use is Leviathan, because Leviathan is a monster in the Bible, a sea monster in the Bible, and there are different interpretations of that. Some Christians think that it's a dinosaur. I don't. I've studied it, and I'm convinced that that Leviathan is a sea dragon of chaos, and it's deliberately symbolic to represent the chaos of the world that God pushes back. And in order to create his covenanted order. So it's bringing order out of chaos. And, so that he, like in Psalm 73, talks about God establishing his covenant with Moses and how he crushes the heads of Leviathan as he brings them through the Red Sea. So that's a symbolic reference to God creating his covenanted order out of chaos. But I thought that is such a cool image. I want to literalize that. And so I literally have a sea dragon with 7 heads that shows up in the tails. But anyone who's reading it will know that I'm not turning the Bible into myth. I'm just sort of telling a theological story, and I'm bringing out those theological spiritual elements. And as the series goes on, I try to become a little bit more and more realistic in terms of those fantasy images, a little bit less fantasy and a little bit more reality. But at the end of the day, we really don't know, because I'm filling in a lot of lines in between the scriptures. But my goal was to retell a story and try to stay as true as I can to the original text, because obviously my readers have a high regard for the Bible and high regard for it, and sort of fill in between the lines in a way that is consistent. And so, sure, I sometimes have to telescope time. I leave out events and characters because you can't tell everything. But in terms of just staying true to what we do know, I did my best to do that. And that was sort of my goal, my tightrope walking of between showing supernatural and using fantasy and also trying to stay true to the text.
Awesome. Now, this is the 7th book in the series. The way that you've set them up, are you able to just pick up the most recent or pick up any of them and just sort of go for it from there? Or is there a value in reading them in order?
Well, both. I do try to write them so that they can be standalone, because I realize that each of these stories, for instance, I tell the story of the Promised Land, Joshua and Caleb, right? And but then, of course, that's 400 years after Abraham, which is the previous book. So there's like huge periods of time in between these books. So technically, they are standalone. You can pick them up if you like the story of David or you just want to read the story of Abraham. You can do that, and you can still enjoy the story. However, they are written in such a way that they are so integrated with each other, and there is a underlying developing plot that carries over with the Watchers and with the gods, the ancient gods of the pagan world and such. And of course God's plan as well. So there is a storyline that you will get more out of it if you read it in the series, but you don't have to be able to appreciate the story. They are kind of standalone in and of themselves, or at least I hope they are. Tell me if they aren't. I don't know. I mean, I try to make them that way.
Well, in this, in David Ascendant, you mentioned previously the sons of Rapha, and the most famous one being Goliath, and everyone kind of knows Goliath as the giant, but I think you seem to have brought in some different characters along with Goliath. Can you speak on some of those, like Lami and Saf, and I mean there are a few others.
Yeah. Well, okay, so I come at the book and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, the story of David, it's the one biblical hero that we have the most information about, right? And it's also, one of the most beloved stories because it's so detailed. And in fact, in terms of biographies, in the ancient world, it was kind of unique in terms of its being closer to a modern sort of way of telling a story than in the ancient world. So people know a lot about it. And of course, David and Goliath story is, to me, it's almost, it's cliche. And I'm thinking, oh, how can I write something that's interesting? But what I discovered was, okay, what was my goal? My goal was only tell the stories that are related to the giants. And Goliath wasn't the only giant. And that was the amazing, exciting thing I discovered in my research was, there are several passages in 1 Chronicles 20, 2 Samuel 21, 1 Chronicles 11, and 2 Samuel 23. And some of these are duplicates, but those several passages, just sort of out of context, out of place, they have in complete paragraphs where they describe these giants who went after David. Like, for instance, in 2 Samuel, it says, Ishbi-Benob, one of the descendants of the giants whose spear weighed 300 shekels of bronze, who was armed with a new sword, fought to kill David. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, came to his aid and attacked the Philistine and killed him. And then it goes on and it lists more giants who were after David and his mighty men who killed them. And I thought, wow, that's really fascinating. And they even named some of them, like you mentioned. Ishbi-Benob was one, Saf was another, and then Lami, the brother of Goliath. And of course, that's an easy one, right? Revenge for Goliath, that would be an easy one. But what's the connection of these other ones? And they're all spoken of in the same paragraph context. And so I read, there's this one scholar, Conrad LaRue, and I have his article on my website, actually for free. You can go on the website and read it. He makes this argument that if you look at the Hebrew of the phrase descendants of the giants, which is what all of these, Saf was a descendant of the giant, Ishbi-Benob was a descendant of the giant. And this phrase keeps coming over and over. And in the Hebrew, it's actually Yelid ha-Rapha. And of course, Rapha is a reference to those giants. But the Yelid, this scholar, makes this point that the phraseology is the kind of phraseology that you would use for a military cult. So it's almost like these guys might be a part of a specific military cult with a particular agenda. And they, Rapha might be some giant deity that they worship, or it could be a reference to their identity as giants, right? And so I thought, wow, that's fascinating. And it makes sense because if the premise of the whole series, Chronicles of the Nephilim, goes back to Genesis 3:16, where it says, or 3:15, where it says, God's cursing the serpent, and he says, I will put enmity between your seed and her seed, and he will crush your head, you will bite his heel. And many scholars will say that that's the first messianic prophecy, and that's what the whole series is about. It's the seed of the serpent versus the seed of Eve, or now the seed of Abraham. And the seed of the serpent, basically is connected to the Nephilim and the Watchers, but also basically those who reside in the land of Canaan that God is going to dispossess. And by the time of Joshua went into the promised land, and we're all familiar with Numbers 32, where it talks about there's giants in the land, the Anakim, and they're fearful of them. Well, Joshua goes in and he basically wipes them all out. And then in Joshua 11, it says, Joshua hunted down all the Anakim in all the land, specifically taking out the giants. And I think that's because they're connected to the seed of the serpent. And then it says, but he left some of them, but he left some of them in the cities of Gath and Gaza and on the coast. And a couple, I think Ashkelon or something, but they're basically the cities of the Philistines. So it says that Joshua wiped them all out except for those in the cities of some of the Philistines. And then now, by the time of David, in 1000 BC, which is, maybe 300 or 200, 300 years later, depending on what view you have. But nevertheless, David comes along, and he's the Messiah king. He's the anointed one, the Messiah king of Israel. And he's actually the sort of the epitome of what the ultimate Christ will be, right? And so David comes in, and there's these giants left over, and they've sort of proliferated now. And Goliath is one of the first champions that he faces down. And so there's a symbolic thing going on here with David killing the last of the Rephaim, but then he goes into all these battles against the Philistines, and then we get this listing of these giants who were specifically after David. So David Ascendant, I chose to tell the story. Everyone thinks of David and Goliath and David and Bathsheba, right? My story ends before David and Bathsheba. It tells the whole ascendancy of him to kingship. But it deals with Goliath in the context that there may have been this military cult that was hunting the Messiah king, to kill him. And so David, as the Messiah king, ends up, his men or him, kills the last of these giants in the land. And then there are battles against that in a valley that they ended up calling the Valley of the Rephaim. So in asking myself this question about what story am I going to tell, I figured I'm going to tell the story of these giants, go into the Philistine culture, really go in depth into that, and make that come alive. And of course, we don't know anything about these giants because the Bible only names them and then says they were killed by someone. So I'm making up all their stories, but in a way that is consistent. And then David, as the Messiah king, it talks about him having these battles in the Valley of the Rephaim, which is a title of the valley that I think is indicated by the fact that he killed all those Rephaim giants in his battles, right, as he took over the Promised Land. And after the time of David, then we never really hear anything more about giants. And so that's the story that I chose to tell. And but I also said, you know what? I wanted to have the romances of David with his wives, Abigail and Michal, and so I have those in there as well. And I also try to tell the story of David himself and how his personal struggles as a man after God's own heart, but he also had a weakness for women, and he was a man of much bloodshed. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to show that complex character of a sinful human being that God chooses to be his means of accomplishing his purposes, right, and to show that he uses imperfect, sinful vehicles or vessels to accomplish his purposes. And that should be an encouragement to I think, to many of us, because, many of us feel like failures or feel like such sinners when we look at our lives,
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I was going to say, David had some pretty saucy moments. I mean, I don't know what the age range is on this book, but we get a little peek behind the veil in some of those?
Well, if anybody has read the series, they know that it's at least PG-13. So it is a little progressive in that sense. But I try to deal with the realities of depravity, both violence and sexuality, without going into too much detail, but I don't hide it. Mm-hmm. But I also try to show good married love in contrast to that evil sexuality. So, that's one thing that I think really lacks is that I think a lot of Christians might be, when they try to tell their stories, they try to avoid showing the depravity and showing the evil because they think that that's exploitative or that's creates bad images in our minds, yada, yada. But I think the Bible itself is rated R in many places. And I think that the power of the redemption of your story is only as good as the accuracy with which you depict the evil that you're redeemed from. Right. And so I do deal with evil sexuality, evil violence and such, but I also contrast it and I try to show what good married life is and married love, and more than just, oh, they loved each other and they kissed each other, because that doesn't show anything. That's not a comparison. If you read the Song of Solomon, you'll find, it's not pornographic, but it is erotic, and it is poetic, but it's also in the original Hebrew. It's actually more explicit than it is in the English translations, because our English translators were actually more prudish. And so my point here is that I try to contrast good married erotic love with the evil sexuality. But again, I try not to be pornographic about it, and I try to be PG-13 so that you're showing that reality. So when God's redemption comes in, it has that power that I want it to have.
Awesome. Right. So it's not quite the drugstore paperback romance novel, but
no.
Okay.
But it's not your Christian Amish romance.
You had just recently been on Like Flint, and I recall you talking about the power of redemption in your stories, or any story, that the redemption aspect of it is only as good as the evil that it portrays. So I think getting into David's, you were mentioning how he's a complex character. It makes sense that you kind of have to show his human side to really get to that point of the redeeming aspect of the story. Do you carry that through, and does it do you have that element in every story or every book, that its own redemption element?
Yes, I do. And each character that whether it's Joshua or Caleb or whatever, each character is, I try to make them a complex, realistic human being, and they have a character arc where they grow. So Joshua was victorious, but he wasn't sinless. And so in my Joshua book, I have a major issue, a problem with violence that he has to overcome. And the same thing with David. I have David, in the story of David and Abigail was originally married to Nabal, this wicked rich man. And, but David was treating him, if you look at the text, it looks to me like David was pretty much treating him like a mafia would with protection money, oh, I'm taking care of you. I'm watching over your shepherds and protecting them. So give me a bunch of food, for this party we're going to have. Right. And the guy's like, well, I didn't ask you to protect them, And so David is not perfect either. He does some things that God doesn't necessarily approve of. But I think that's the whole point, is that Bible heroes are not perfect men. They're sinners just like us. And in fact, in many ways, if you look at a lot of ancient literature, their hero stories are much more hagiographic, which means they are much more like perfect guys, you know what I mean? Right. And the Bible heroes are kind of unusual in that they show the faults of their heroes. Why? Because the ultimate hero is their God, Yahweh. Yahweh is the only one who is perfect, and he uses broken vessels to accomplish his purposes, Yeah. So that's been my goal in all the books, and all the heroes of my books have character arcs where they learn something and they have to find redemption, whether it's Noah, Abraham, Joshua, or even David.
Right. Now, you mentioned a few times, how this isn't your traditional sort of Bible story, or it's I wouldn't say reimagined, but told in a different way. And you try your best to stay along the biblical guidelines, and yet there's, well, maybe even more so with the biblical guidelines, all the romance and the violence and things like that. Have you felt any pushback from anybody about your stories or the way that you go about telling them?
Quite frankly, not really. I actually expected to get some negative responses, because I don't come at this like a fundamentalist where it's like, every jot and tittle I have to follow in the Bible and, my interpretation. And, I'm very, like I said, I fill in some gaps with imagination and such, and I expected there to be more of a backlash against me, but there really hasn't been. Sure, there's always a few people who are going to say, well, that didn't happen in the Bible, or that's not like that, or, they have disagreements with me, but I haven't been attacked. It's just been a handful of people that have really lashed out at it. Most, like if you go to Amazon and you look at all the responses on there, not all of them like the book, but there's very few. Most of them basically get it. They get it. They say, okay, he's not trying to write scripture here. He's trying to retell the story, and he's trying to imbue it with a theological perspective. They get it, and I'm really proud of the fact that shows that a lot of Christians these days have a much more sophisticated understanding of literature, which is very encouraging to me. On the other hand, I haven't sold millions of copies yet, so you know what I mean? Like, it may be a bestseller on the Amazon biblical fiction list, but I'm not selling hundreds of thousands or anything like that. And I'm sure that if I started to sell a lot more of these, if I started to get up into the New York Times best-selling list or whatever, I'm sure I'll get attacked by a lot of fundamentalists or types who would really, hate my use of fantasy in there.
Right. Yeah, well, I see here on Amazon, I mean, you've got a lot of good ratings. There's nothing lower than 4.5 stars. So you're doing well, I think, here. I
think I got a couple of 1s and 2s, but every book is going to have that. And if you look at those, they're kind of goofy, and you go, okay, this guy's just a goof nut,
Goof nut.
Yeah, goof nut. But no, I've really been surprised. But like I said, I think if it gets more and more popular, more people might come out of the work and be more nitpicky about it. Like I've had some people. What's ironic is I've had some responses of people who agree with me more generally, like about the Nephilim, because that's another thing. In Christendom, I think most conservative Christians don't want to deal with the whole issue of the Nephilim and the Watchers because it's bizarre. It sounds like mythology. And I admit it is a difficult one to really sort of handle. But I'm convinced that the Bible talks about that. And I think that they're afraid to deal with it. So they come up with different interpretations. Oh, the Nephilim it's just a phrase for mighty warriors. It's not really giants. And the sons of God that mated with the daughters of men, those are just royalty or kings that call themselves gods. It wasn't really sons of God from God's divine counsel. No. So they try to get around it. But most of the people I've had some people who agree with my interpretation, that basically the sons of God are divine beings from God's counsel, mate with human women, Nephilim are giants, right? And all this stuff. But then they'll nitpick about really detailed interpretations of things that aren't as important to me. So it's kind of funny where it's like, it's not so much about what the Bible's saying as what their interpretation is, you know what I mean? And there's room for differing opinions on that. So I don't really have a problem with that. That's fun to me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
Well, what do you think, you had mentioned, and I think the arc of the giants really sort of, I guess not necessarily ends, but the major sort of lineage of giants seems to come to a halt anyway around Goliath and the Philistines and stuff. And once they're out of the picture, there isn't a whole lot mentioned, anything obvious anyway, about giants that I'm aware of.
Yeah.
Is that something that you found to be the case as well? And tying into that, I believe you have one more, or I guess two more books that are in the series. What do you plan to do with Jesus Triumphant and then I guess where the landing spot is with when giants were upon the earth? Is that kind of a supplementary?
Yeah. When giants were upon the earth is actually what I do in each of the novels. Because I knew that this is going to be a wild interpretation for some people to handle, and again, I know my major audience is going to be Christians, so Christians are, they tend to demand a little bit more explanation of things. So I thought, I'll put in at the back of each book, I put an appendix, and I explain some of my research that the book is based on. And this is something that Michael Crichton used to do. You know, he would put an appendix where he explained the real science that his fiction was based on. So I kind of like doing that. So anyway, I did that, and a lot of Christians were saying, "Hey, I really love the appendix as much as the novel." So I thought, well, why don't I put all the appendices in one book for those who want to just focus on that? And I realized that it wasn't like just an arbitrary collection of things. It also told that story, because as the progression of the appendices goes, it creates a narrative itself. And so what I did was I released the book When Giants Were Upon the Earth, and it already has the first draft of my research for Jesus Triumphant in it. And there are several spiritual things that are connected to the Watchers in the Gospels, and those are going to come out. But there's also I'm going to use the interpretation. It's a tradition. It's not certain, but I'm going to use the Enochian interpretation that the demons are the spirits of the dead Nephilim, and that's where they come back in. And I do think theologically that it makes sense with the whole messianic, because think about it. Really, there's not much in the Old Testament about demons. There's a couple spots, King Saul was taunted by an evil spirit, but there really isn't much at all, almost nothing. And then all of a sudden, when Jesus comes on the scene, there's this eruption of demonic activity. Why? Well, I think that there's a theological purpose for that. It's not arbitrary, and Jesus casting out demons is sort of like casting out the evil spirits of the land in Canaan as the Messiah enters in. So I think that there's a spiritual theological connection going on there that I hope to explore, but I'm still in the early stages of developing the story.
Right. And I think, something that I am speculating that you might touch on is that, and I've brought this up in, I have a video that talks about the sons of God and the Sethite view debunked, and I touch on it, and others have touched on this too, but one of the criticisms, or I guess it's a rebuttal that you get for the whole Genesis 6 Watchers view is that, the sons of God are the descendants of Seth. And I think we tackled that the last time you were on, but one of the things they'll say is that, well, the sons of God is a phrase that is used of us in the New Testament. Once we're saved, we are children of God, things like that. So do you tackle that at all? And what do you think is going on there in terms of the phrase sons of God? Yeah.
Well, actually, I agree with them in the sense that I think there is a connection to that. It's not a separate thing. Right. I think it may be somewhat different, obviously, because we're not exactly the same as angels or whatever. But and this is where Michael Heiser's work is very helpful, because as a scholar, he does go into that in more detail. But I am going to try to incorporate some of that. In other words, I do believe that there's a sense in which when God originally created man in the garden and stuff, we were intended to be part of his family of sons of God that were around his throne, Right. And when the fall came, that broke all that apart, right? And separated us. And so consequently, the goal of getting back to the garden, so to speak, or getting back to what God originally planned, his plan of redemption, what Messiah does is, I think we will actually, part of our redemption process and the resurrection and what we become, it says we will be changed and transformed and be like him, right? We will be like him. Well, we're not going to be gods in some literal sense, but we're going to be sons of God like those around his throne. We will have that nature of being in God's presence and being his very children. And so I don't think the sons of God phrase, I think that phrase in the New Testament is somehow connected to the Old Testament phrase. Right. But of course, we are different in that we are human beings, and therefore, there's going to be a difference going on there. But what exactly that is, I'm not sure, and I'm still exploring that. Right. But I do hope to deal with that a little bit in the novel. Yeah, because what I've discovered with some study on the topic is that basically the sons of God, or that phrase, represents a direct creation of God. And I get that from Luke 3:38, where it's talking about the lineage all the way going backwards to Adam, and it's, the son of Enosh, the son of Seth, the son of Adam, and Adam is called the son of God. And so it's kind of like and then of course when we're saved, we're baptized in the Spirit and we're born again, and when that happens, we become sons of God, in that we are a new creation, right? So I think that the phrase represents
literally a direct creation of God. And so when you talk about angels or, these angelic beings or divine hosts and things like that, we're looking at entities or, as Mike Kaiser calls it, a heavenly bureaucracy that were direct creations of God, and that, the sin that they committed was, just as deplorable as the sin that we live in. But we are born as sons of Adam, as men. Yeah. And then once we are redeemed, that's when we get the title sons of God. So, I mean, those are things that
right. Excellent. In fact, like I said, you're a little bit more advanced in your ability to describe it. I'm still in my research mode, but I totally agree with that. And my element that I would bring to that is just that, yes, we are new creations. We've been baptized with the Holy Spirit. We are new, but it's now and not yet. In other words, we have not what will yet become. So I'm thinking the final consummation will be our total transformation into whatever that sons of God is to be. But that has to be with being around God's presence in his holy throne and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying. And I appreciate that. Now I'll have to put a thank you to Gons in my next book.
Yay.
Well, I was once again scrolling through the character page here, just because I think it's so rad. But then every time I get to this picture of the linemen of Moab, I wet myself a little bit. Let's talk about that a little bit. I mean, this was an interesting way to portray.
Yeah. This is one of those weird passages in the Bible where, and I write about this in the appendix too, but there's this description in, let me see if I can find, do you have the actual text?
I'm trying to find it as well. I know it's, First Chronicles 12.
I know where it is. First Chronicles 12?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
They're fierce.
Why don't you read that for us?
And now a scripture reading from God.
From the Gadites there went over to David at the stronghold in the wilderness mighty and experienced warriors, expert with shield and spear, whose faces were like the faces of lions, and who were swift as gazelles upon the mountains.
That's actually the second verse. The more specific verse is actually, I think I can find it now.
I failed.
It's earlier than that. And here it is. Here's where the lion men come from. In 2 Samuel 23, it's talking about David's mighty men. And these were the guys that did all these mighty exploits, like killing 800 at one time, right? So these guys were mighty. And some of these mighty men killed some of the giants. In fact, one of them was Benaiah. Benaiah was the captain of David's guard. And it says that he killed an Egyptian giant, an unnamed one, who was about 7.5 feet tall. But it also says in this passage, 2 Samuel 23, it says down around verse 20, it says, Benaiah, the son of Jehoiada, he struck down 2 Ariels of Moab. He also went down, struck a lion in a pit, and struck down an Egyptian who was a giant. So this word Ariels is a very difficult Hebrew word. Many scholars, it's a confusing word. They're not sure what it means. But some translations call it lion men of Moab. And the reason why is because it sort of is a combination of the word for lion, but also the word El is for God. And so it's like lions of God or lion men who are mighty men. And so there's one tradition that speaks of these men, that they were kind of like lion-like creatures. Like they were men, but they had this lion-like appearance. And then that other chapter, there's another passage that Gons had mentioned, where it also describes these Gadites. And the Gadites, if I can find that one, where was that passage? Do you remember that one?
The one I just...
Chronicles, somewhere in First Chronicles.
Yeah, the one I just read.
Yeah.
First Chronicles 12:8.
Right. So here it is. Yeah. So it talks about from the Gadites that there were men whose faces were like the faces of lions and who were swift as gazelles upon the mountains. Well, you can look at that and say, well, that's metaphorical. And that's true. It is metaphorical, swift as gazelles and using animals as a comparison. However, the interesting thing is the tribe of the Gadites were over in the land of Moab. And this concept of whose faces were like the faces of lions actually could be a literal transcription. And so in my story, David Ascendant, what I did was I said, well, look, if the Gadite tribe is over in the land of Moab, so some of the Moabites might have joined the tribe of Gad, and they could have been these lion men, and they became these Gadite lion men. And it even gives some of their names. And so it's not entirely sure what that means, but there is a tradition of scholarship that indicates that these Ariels, which is the Hebrew word, may actually be men that were kind of like lions. And what that means, I don't know. But in my book, I basically made them, they had manes and they were wild, but they were also warriors and they were also very loyal men. And I have this tribe of these Gadite lion men of Moab join David. And then it also says in that 2 Samuel passage, though, it says that Benaiah himself struck down two of these lion men of Moab. So I actually tell a story of how that occurred. And again, we don't know the details from the Bible, so I had to make it up and integrated it in the storyline. So, this is where I'm pushing the boundaries. I'm not entirely sure. There is some scholarship that suggests maybe these might be some kind of chimeric, human beings mixed with lion genetic DNA. I don't know.
Right.
But I decided to go with it and push that, because even if they weren't literally lion-like men, they were certainly mighty warriors that stood out. And so, again, I'm using that fantasy element. I'm not entirely sure what it means, and the scholarship isn't sure on it, but there is some that says that it might be this sort of men who look like lions. So I went with it.
I like it.
Well, if the scholars are saying we don't know, then, it's that much easier to inject your own, sort of imagery of it. And I always figured that it was sort of lion men. There
are stranger things in the Bible.
Yeah,
exactly. And that's my point. And I'm willing to admit that there could be weird things that we don't have any explanation for. And that's, again, when you're writing fiction, you have a little bit more freedom to go with it, because I don't have to sit there and prove it with absolute certainty. But I think my interpretation is still theologically consistent with what the Bible is basically saying. So that's where if you read David Ascendant, you're going to see these wild things come up, lion men of Moab. You're going to see these giants, and you're going to see them battling some of these mighty men. And I came up with some real wild things. Like, for instance, okay, let me tell you this weird thing. That one passage where it talks about the, which I'm going to pull up here, where it talks about the various giants, if I can find it. In one of these passages about the giants in Samuel, it talks about Ishbi-Benob. And Ishbi-Benob, it says he had a new sword and he thought to kill David.
Right.
Well, that word, there's no word in there that says new sword. That's actually filled in by translators, because the way the sentence is constructed in Hebrew, some scholars say that it says new weapon. It actually just means a new weapon, and they just felt, well, it must be a sword, so they put in sword. But what if it wasn't? What if it was this wild new weapon that we don't know about?
Right.
And as a matter of fact, that was how they described the loop javelin that Goliath had. It said that it had a shaft like a weaver's beam, and some people assume, that means it was real big and thick like a weaver's beam. But no, it doesn't mean that. It actually means, if you look at a weaver's beam had loops and stuff, and it was basically the Jews looking at the strange new weapon, which was from Mycenae, and they created a javelin with a rope connected to it that would stick to their fingers, so that when they threw the javelin, they would use the rope to help project it further and faster. And that's what looked like a weaver's beam that had loop strings on it, right?
Right.
And it was basically a way for them to throw the javelin farther and faster and stronger. And so that's an example where the Hebrews may not have seen it before, so they describe what it looks like. And in this case, it says he had a new weapon. And guess what? I have a weapon in my storyline of Chronicles of the Nephilim that sort of ended up starting in the first novel and has been handed down throughout the series, and it's called Rahab, the whip sword. And so I kind of worked that in there in a very clever way. So my point here is that there's some oddities in the text that I try to incorporate into the story in a way that people will really find exciting.
Right.
Here's another one. Ishbi-Benob. That's one of the giants. Well, if you look at the name, it might be Ishbi ben Ob. And the word ben means son of.
Right.
And the word Ob is actually the name of a necromancer or a medium. It's the Hebrew word for necromancer or medium. Like when Saul goes to visit that witch of Endor, it's actually an Ob of Endor, which is actually a necromancer or a medium, not necessarily what we know as witch. And so I thought, well, maybe his name is an indication that this giant was the son of some Ob or necromancer, so he has demonic activity around him because of that. So these are some of the things that I try to incorporate out of my research into the story that I think people will find wild.
Yeah.
And wait till you see what the evil spirit, who the evil spirit is who haunts Saul. It'll be very, for those who know the series, they're going to love it.
Awesome. That's cool. I need to know that. I'm going to feverishly read this book. Well, awesome. That's really cool. You know, I've really enjoyed hearing what you have to say about the book beforehand actually gives a lot more insight into, what I can expect, and actually kind of raises the awareness of your process of writing. You know what I mean? So it's not all just imaginary stuff that you thought up. It's stuff that stems from actual research and looking a little bit deeper into the biblical texts.
Yeah, quite frankly, I'm not really that creative or original. I steal a lot from the ancient texts, and you're right though. That's one of the reasons why I knew that people would read this story, Christians who are familiar with the Bible, and they might think this is so wild, it's all made up. But you're right. So much of it is actually based on research. That's one of the reasons why I put the appendix in there, so people can really see, like, oh no, it wasn't completely made up. It's definitely creatively adapted and integrated, but it's definitely, I try to base most everything in there. I try to base it on, if not something in the Bible or the background of the Bible text, but something rooted in the ancient Near Eastern worldview that will make sense of it. So yeah, that's been my goal all along.
And just
cool.
Real briefly, just because I pulled it up and I wanted to mention it, that passage you talked about with the new weapon, it talks about how it was a spear and it was 300 shekels of bronze. And I just did the quick calculation. 300 shekels is thought to be about 7.5 pounds. So that's a pretty big spearhead if it's 7.5 pounds.
Yeah.
And it would take a pretty strong fella to throw that effectively, and it would probably be pretty damaging.
Yeah,
absolutely. Sure. And then there's another text where it talks about, it actually gives a man that and again, this was killed by Jonathan, son of Shimei. It says that he had 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot, 24 in number.
Right.
And he was also descended from the giants. And this is where a lot of us get our notion that, maybe these Nephilim had these 6 fingers and 6 toes. Not necessarily all of them, but this is one of those striking indications that maybe that's one of the traits of some of the Nephilim. Certainly, some of the giants.
Right. We're kind of coming towards the end here, but I am curious, and I want to ask you, because one of the things that I'm noticing is that it seemed like the descendants of the giants were somehow, I don't know if they intermingled with human seed. I don't know if that's plausible even. But what do you think happened as far as? Do you think that there's humans walking the earth today that have a very minute strand of DNA that might have a little Nephilim gene? I mean, how far does it go? In your mind and in your research?
Yeah. Well, yeah, you bring up a great question, and to be quite honest, that's above my pay grade. I have not looked much into that. I do see that as being somewhat of a problem, somewhat of an issue that should probably be thought through and worked out. I have not been able to spend much time in that, working that out. However, I think just in the biblical text alone, the impression that they're giving is, or at least the impression in the text that I see is, that a lot of these giants are connected to the Holy Land. They're the ones that God once wiped out, and he pretty much wipes them out mostly with Joshua, then finishes wiping them out with David, and then we don't hear about them anymore. So whether or not they continue on beyond that, I don't know. And it wouldn't be unbiblical to suggest that it might be, because one of my premises in all my novels, which I think is in all the stories of the Bible, is this, and that is that no matter how much God does judge evil, whether it's Noah's flood or David and the giants or Joshua in the Holy Land, he never fully wipes it all out. And evil there's always a little remnant of evil that continues on, even to this present day, right? I mean, we can't deny that. That's a reality. And so the point is not that God doesn't save well enough. The point is that God does periodic, judgment of evil, or periodic making the world better, etc. But there's always a remnant of evil that continues on until, of course, the end, when Christ comes and finally destroys death itself and all that. And I think that's part of the message of the Bible is, no matter how much goodness God brings, no matter how much judgment he does bring on sin, there's still some that always survives. And that doesn't make God incompetent. That merely means he has a plan for what he's accomplishing, and that the continuation of evil is still part of that, and we can't deny that reality, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think that even though, as I look at the text, I don't hear anything more about the giants in the Bible beyond that, it doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't something that continues on. But what it is, I have not speculated into that. That's gone beyond what I've researched.
Yeah. Well, Brian, thank you so much for coming on the show. Brian Godawa, the author of the new book, David Ascendant, book 7 of the Chronicles of the Nephilim. Thanks so much, man. How do we get to look at more of your stuff, and where can we get the book, and tell us all your things?
2 quick things, and yeah, definitely. The website you guys we've all been talking about that has all the cool artwork, free articles, cool pictures, yada, yada, is chroniclesoftheNephilim.com. chroniclesoftheNephilim.com. And then you can buy any of the books. They're all exclusively on Amazon.com in both Kindle or paperback. I've been finding that a lot of people have been really getting into audiobooks lately. I've been selling as much on my audiobooks as I have been on my Kindle and paperbacks, because people are really getting into that. So yeah, you can get it in all 3 formats through Amazon.
Yeah, and maybe you might hear a little bit of
Basil, the awesome voice actor.
Thanks for having me, guys.
You betcha, man. All right, you take it easy. Make sure to go to Amazon and Kindle and Audible and chroniclesoftheNephilim.com. Check out his books, his audiobooks. Really, really cool stuff. Go do that right now, or else. And thanks for listening to this episode of Canary Cry Radio. Make sure to tune in next time. But until you do, think outside the cage.